Hello to my friends joining us via recording. Today we are working on the lesson number 7 lab about muscle tissue and about the bones and muscles of the thorax and abdomen. To begin our class today, we started by working in groups on figuring out some characteristics of the different types of muscle tissue that we have in the body. For my friends here in class, I need you to help me out in the chat. We have pictures of the 3 types of muscle tissue in the body that I see here. When I am answering these questions here, I need to be able to identify these types of muscle tissue. So this first type of muscle tissue that we see in the top, which type of muscle tissue is this one? Can we tell? What muscle tissue is my first one? Yep, so my first one is an example of smooth muscle. Smooth muscle. My second one, the one in the middle, what kind of muscle tissue is that one? Could we tell? Yeah, so my one in the middle is an example of skeletal muscle. Can't spell muscle this morning. There we go. And that leaves my third and final kind of muscle tissue in the body, yep, which is that cardiac muscle. Absolutely. Let's remind ourselves of the ways that we can identify these, because you do need to be able to identify them for the homework and for the final exam. Smooth muscle tissue, when you're looking at this kind of muscle tissue, remember the nuclei of the cells are really large. We do not see those light and dark lines like we see when we look at some of our other types of muscle tissues. Those light and dark lines are called striations. So I asked you about those on a future slide. Smooth muscle does not have striations. We just see these large nuclei. Often this kind of tissue looks kind of wavy, like we see in here. So smooth muscle tissue in the top. Skeletal muscle tissue, remember there's 2 kinds of pictures that we skeletal muscle tissue. This picture that I see of skeletal muscle tissue is really great for showing me the striations. So if you look up close at my skeletal muscle fibers, you can see light and dark, alternating back and forth. Skeletal muscle tissue. These cells are really long and skinny, so I can see that these are long and skinny cells. Compared to these ones down here, where I've got really small cells that span in between these dark lines are things called intercalated discs. And that's where I connect together these stitching cells that we see inside of here. I've got a question in the chat. Would we say the gaps in skeletal muscle are branches? No. So the spaces that you see in the skeletal muscle are actually spaces in between all the proteins that fill up these cells. So we probably have one cell up here and another cell down here. Each of these little spaces, each of these little red things that we see inside of here are actually individual proteins. So skeletal muscle cells, I'm going to do a terrible drawing here, but we're going to do it anyway. A skeletal muscle cell is really long and skinny. Remember we said that skeletal muscle cells were multinucleate. My other drawing of them made them look like ants on a log, right? So multiple nuclei. But when we're inside the cell, we also see individual protein tubes that are all packed next to each other. So these individual protein tubes that are all packed next to each other, we're seeing a bunch of those tubes squeezed together, but not squeezed together totally. That's why there's some space right here. Or there's some space right here because my protein tubes aren't squeezed all the way together. We're going to look at the model for skeletal muscle tissue here in a moment. And when you're looking at that model, consider that these spaces that we're seeing here are just places where we're in between the bunches of proteins that are squeezed together. So skeletal muscle tissue is not branched. Skeletal muscle cells are just long and skinny, and they're filled with protein tubes. So these protein tubes are the little tubes that are inside this cell here. Good question. My only branch cell, cardiac muscle cells. Otherwise, these guys are really long and skinny. These guys are something, it's a term you'll see in your lab packet. It's called spindle-shaped. Spindle-shaped, which means that these muscle cells, instead of being long and skinny, are a little bit more like this. Their nucleus is in the middle of the cell, and then we've got two small parts on either end. So long and skinny skeletal muscle, spindle-shaped smooth muscle, and then branching cardiac muscle. All right, let me clear my board because I want us to match up these statements that we see here on the screen with our muscle tissue. So you guys can do this here because we have access to the pencil. Right above my finger, there's that pencil. Go ahead and click on that. Let's work on drawing lines between my statements and the type of muscle tissue that they apply to. So grab that pencil, draw some lines. Let's connect the dots, if we will. Awesome. Love it. We got a beautiful mess going on, right? This is perfect. All right. So we've connected our lines. We generally seem to agree. Let me start with the bottom statement because that goes to my type of muscle tissue up here. My bottom statement here, I'm found in blood vessels. Which type of muscle tissue is found in blood vessels? Can you type it in the chat for me? Which muscle tissue is there in those blood vessels? Yeah, that's a location of smooth muscle tissue. Smooth muscle tissue, also identified, is the type of muscle tissue found in the intestines. Smooth muscle tissue. So lining hollow organs. Oh yeah, someone drew a heart, right? That's fitting for when we're talking about the muscle tissue there. When we're talking about smooth muscle tissue, the way that your location and function guide described it was it's lining hollow organs. That just means stuff that there's space in the middle. So inside the intestines, inside the blood vessels, inside the respiratory tract, for example. Here's a heads up for you. If someone is having an asthma attack and their airways are suddenly shrinking, it's because the smooth muscle in their airways has decided that it's time to contract. So another location we could add would be the airway, for example. So the intestines, the blood vessels, the airways, those are all locations where we find smooth muscle tissue. Looks like we mostly agree here. Which type of tissue do we find in the heart? Which one lives there? Our heart type of tissue, right? Which kind of muscle tissue is found in the heart? Yeah, the type of muscle tissue that I find in the heart is called cardiac muscle tissue. So cardiac muscle tissue is the one that we see down here. Remember with cardiac muscle tissue that we see the branched cells and we see those dark things called intercalated discs. So cardiac muscle tissue, literally the only place in the body you find it is in the heart. And literally the only type of muscle in the heart is cardiac muscle tissue. My last type of muscle tissue, its name should give away for me what it is, right? The type of muscle tissue attached to the skeleton, what's that one called? Which type of muscle tissue attaches to the skeleton? Yeah, skeletal muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue. So on your tissue location and function guide, it says it's found inside skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles are just the types of muscles that are attached to the skeleton that make movements happen. So locations, quick review for us from your tissue location and function guide. Make sure we remember where we find these types of muscle tissue. Next, I asked you guys about our some of our different features of muscle tissue. I keep saying this one all the time. Can you guys grab that pencil? Which type of muscle tissue has intercalated discs? Where are we going to draw this line for this one? Yep, look at that. We're getting them all right there. Perfect. Intercalated discs are, yep, these little circles that we see inside here. These dark lines in cardiac muscle tissue, that is the best way that you're going to be able to identify cardiac muscle tissue. So intercalated discs, those dark lines. Hey, help me out in the chat. When I talk about the type or types of muscle tissue that have striations, what would be the names of the muscle tissues that have striations? I'm going to type their names when you give them to me. Which types of muscle tissue have striations? Yeah, so we put a line on our thing. Skeletal muscle tissue, we can definitely see those striations. It's the alternating light and dark. And the other kind of tissue that Nicole mentioned for us, the other one with striations, is cardiac muscle tissue. Two types of muscle tissue that have striations. It's a little hard to see on this picture. If you zoom it in on your screen and you look really close, you'll all see those alternating lines, those stripes like we see in here. But I remember from last time we tried to zoom that it didn't work for you. So I'm not going to waste too much time zooming. But if you zoom in on this picture here, you'll notice that there are light and dark lines inside here, striations. So we said that skeletal and cardiac do have striations. That means my one muscle tissue that does not have striations, what's that one called? The one with no striations. No striations. Yeah, smooth muscle tissue. Smooth muscle tissue gets its name. It's called smooth because it doesn't have striations. So my two other types of muscle tissue do have striations. Smooth muscle tissue is the only kind that does not. So a few of those anatomical features of my types of tissue. Here's our last statement that I ask you guys to do. I ask you guys to figure out which ones were voluntarily controlled versus involuntarily controlled. So in other words, which ones do you have to consciously decide in your mind we're going to contract versus which ones are going to contract all on their own? When we talk about voluntary types of muscle tissue, when we talk about you deciding whether or not muscle tissue contracts, what were some of our thoughts about what is voluntarily controlled? What do you have to decide when it contracts? Yeah, so Kai's mentioning something that we decide when it happens. What we decide when it happens is body movements, right? So when you're taking notes, when you're typing your answer, when you're getting up and walking away, all of those things are things that you decide to do. Which type of muscle tissue helps us to do those kinds of things? Helps us to move, helps us to walk away, helps us to hold our head up. Yep, that's the job of skeletal muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue. And the big way with that is, the big thing we're saying with skeletal muscle tissue is we're talking about body movements. Body movements. You're deciding that these contractions are happening. That is voluntary. You determine when that happens. When we talk about the types of muscle tissue that are involuntarily controlled, meaning you don't decide when this happens, we're actually super happy that these types of muscle tissue are involuntarily controlled. Can you guys tell me, what would we say the function of cardiac muscle is? What's the job of cardiac muscle tissue? Cardiac muscle tissue. Perfect. Yep, in the chat, I'm seeing that it pumps blood through the body. Perfect. That's the job of cardiac muscle tissue. Can we all take a moment to appreciate the fact that you don't have to tell your heart when to contract to pump blood through your body? Because literally your entire life would be sitting there saying, beat, beat, beat. Like that would be all you would do the entire time, is just thinking about making your heart contract. So we're really happy that we don't control cardiac muscle tissue. That would be a really terrible life, just telling our heart when to beat. The other kind of muscle tissue that we do not control is smooth muscle tissue. And what are some of the functions that you can think of for smooth muscle tissue? What does smooth muscle tissue do? Yeah, so Kai gave us the big picture description of what it does in general. Your location of function guide said movement of substances. That's very high and mighty, right? Substances. So some of us are putting in the chat what some of those substances are, which helps us to think about what's moving. Things like food, things like blood. So we were mentioning urine. Okay. I like to make this example here with movement of food. So some of you, or hopefully most of you, had something to eat for breakfast this morning. If you controlled your smooth muscle tissue, you would now be spending the next several hours first telling your stomach to contract. So we'd tell our stomach to contract, contract, contract. When we're done with that food in the stomach, then we'd have to start telling our small intestine to contract, to contract, to contract. We'd spend a couple hours doing that, and then we'd start telling our large intestine to contract, to contract, to contract. We would spend forever. If we had to control these types of muscle tissue, we would spend our entire lives keeping ourselves alive. It's really great that we don't have to figure out the whole blood pumping thing, and we don't have to figure out the whole moving these things throughout the body. So the only kind of muscle tissue that we say is voluntarily controlled, that we decide when it contracts, is skeletal muscle tissue. We do not decide on the other ones. They contract all on their own, which again is good news for us. We don't want to have to figure those things out. Yeah, so I saw the question a couple of times in the chat, which is a good question, asking about shivering. So shivering is an involuntary action. So when we're thinking about shivering, when we're thinking about the process of thermoregulation, body temperature, that is something that you don't control. So it is possible when we're in a situation like we're really cold, or come back in, I think it's lesson number 12, when we're talking about reflexes in the body. That's another example of when we can use skeletal muscle tissue to do something voluntarily. But when we're thinking about skeletal muscle tissue as a whole, the vast majority of what skeletal muscle tissue does is voluntary stuff. But you're correct. Here, we'll make a note for ourselves. Actions like shivering and actions like reflexes, those are involuntary things that skeletal muscle can do. But most of what skeletal muscle does is moves your body. It helps you to maintain your posture, which keeps you upright or lets you lay in the bed, right? So for the most part, we're going to consider skeletal muscle tissue voluntary. We do have the ability to control it. These types of muscle tissue, doesn't matter. We never have the ability to control them. All right, help me out in the chat. What questions do we still have? Or how are we feeling about this content so far? Thumbs up, thumbs down, mind blown. Gloria's rocking the cowboy hat. I like that. Did we forget to caffeinate this morning? We're awfully quiet this morning. I'm going to give you guys some brain power. You can do this. Okay, well, if there are no objections, I'm going to go ahead and move on then, because I want to take us into looking at the 3 models that we have of muscle tissue. So these models of muscle tissue are helping us to visualize what those tissue images from our slides that we were looking at, what they would look like if we could see them in a more cartoon way, if you will, or something that shows some of our features a little bit better. I want to start with my muscle tissue that I see down here in the bottom. This type of muscle tissue that I see down here in the bottom, my cell is branched. See how there's a branch going up and there's a branch going down? Which type of muscle tissue do I see down here? Which type of muscle tissue had branches in its cells? Yeah, that was cardiac muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle tissue. I can tell because number one, my cells are branched. They look kind of like the letter V. Here's the other way I can tell this is cardiac. See this place right here where it looks like there's kind of two pink lines coming together? This right here represents that feature of cardiac muscle tissue that we used to help us identify it on the slides. Those things called intercalated discs. Intercalated discs, the place where my muscle cells come together, cardiac muscle tissue. What I really like about this cardiac muscle tissue model is it shows you this is just the place where two plasma membranes meet, where I go from one cell to another cell. So cardiac muscle tissue, we can see those intercalated discs where the cells come together. We can also see the branching cells that we see in here. When we're looking at cardiac muscle tissue, I'll just mention, even though we don't have to label it, the other thing that we see, all of these little orange spots right here, these are the organelle in my cell that makes ATP. What are all of these orange things that we see right here? Do we know what they are? Christina's totally right. It's our mitochondria. When you look at cardiac muscle tissue, tons and tons of mitochondria. It takes a lot of energy to contract our cardiac muscle. Also, we need to have energy always, all the time, because your cardiac muscle tissue is always contracting. So, cardiac muscle tissue, we've got our branched cells that kind of look like the letter V. I just drew a V on them. Branched cell and those intercalated discs. That's how we recognize this type of tissue. Hey, this type of tissue over here has those cells that we talked about before. We called these spindle-shaped cells. Spindle-shaped cells. What is the type of muscle tissue that has spindle-shaped cells? Do we remember? Yeah, so the type of muscle tissue that has spindle-shaped cells, meaning that they've got small parts on the two edges and a big part in the middle, that's smooth muscle tissue. In a smooth muscle tissue cell, the nucleus, that's the blue dot here in the middle of the cell, the nucleus of the cell is very large compared to the overall size of the cell. The nucleus is actually the reason why the middle of this spindle-shaped cell is so large. It's because it's found there in the middle of it. No nucleus on either sides, so that makes this cell really skinny on the sides, really large in the middle. Smooth muscle tissue like we see here, which means my last kind of muscle tissue that I can see right here. Which type of muscle tissue is this one that we're looking at? My last type of muscle tissue in the body. Yeah, we're looking at skeletal muscle tissue in the top. Skeletal muscle tissue. When we're talking about skeletal muscle tissue, there are actually multiple things that we need to be able to identify. So the first thing that we need to be able to identify are each of these little tubes that you see right here. So imagine that this is 3D, and I've got a tube that's pointing up and a tube that's pointing up. I've got more tubes pointing up. You can see actually a cross section of them in the bottom. So imagine that this shoots straight up made of proteins, or this shoots straight up made of proteins. Each of these protein tubes are called myofibrils. Myofibrils. So it's the long protein tubes that fill the cells, long protein tubes. Earlier in class, we asked about on the slide if these cells were branched, because we saw some spaces. See how there's a space right here from one myofibril to the next? That's that empty space that we're seeing, the space in between our protein tubes, in between our myofibrils. So this is a myofibril, this is a myofibril. Each of these little circles are showing me what it looks like if I chop a myofibril and look at it. So skeletal muscle cells are filled with myofibrils. Wrapping around these myofibrils, these protein tubes that we see here, are these little blue lines that you see. So I've got a blue line here, here. These blue lines represent something that we call T-Tubules. T-Tubules are places where I take the plasma membrane of the cell that I see on the outside and I fold it in to make little tubes. So these tubes, called tubules, wrap around each of the myofibrils. So a T-tubule is a place where I fold in the membrane. As we will talk about next week, starting next week with muscle tissue, T-tubules, their job is to help us contract an entire muscle cell. We send a message across the entire membrane of a muscle cell to get it to contract, and we need to send that message all the way into the middle of the muscle cell. So T-tubules are these little tubes that we see inside here, formed by folding in my plasma membrane. They are right next to this yellow stuff that I see right here that also wraps around my myofibrils. So the yellow stuff, let me put a box around it. All of this yellow stuff, that color is terrible. That kind of looks like a spider web, or sometimes the way I describe it to my students is I call it like cheesecloth, if anyone knows what cheesecloth is. This stuff is called the Sarcoplasmic Reticulum. The Sarcoplasmic Reticulum. Hey, I promise this is not a trick question. The Sarcoplasmic Reticulum is an organelle that I find in every other cell. I just have a special name for it when I'm in a muscle cell. Which organelle do you think the Sarcoplasmic Reticulum represents? What does it sound a lot like? The Sarcoplasmic Reticulum. Yeah, so Sarcoplasmic Reticulum, we got the reticulum word, right? So reticulum, we actually had word for word. Plasmic was part of the word endoplasmic. The Sarcoplasmic Reticulum is a skeletal muscle fibers version of the endoplasmic reticulum. In particular, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, the smooth ER. All of this spiderweb cheesecloth stuff that I see here is a muscle cell's version of the smooth ER. So in a muscle cell, the smooth ER, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, its big job is to store calcium. Store calcium, I'm going to abbreviate that. Because calcium is what I'm going to use to make muscle contraction happen inside my cell. So all of these spiderweb things that you see right here, these guys are called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And their job is to store calcium that I will spit out when I want to do muscle contraction. If I don't want to do muscle contraction, I'm going to hide the calcium inside these little tubes that wrap all around my myofibrils. These myofibrils will get shorter when it's time for me to do muscle contraction. I'll squeeze them together, allowing my muscle cell to get shorter, which allows me to do my movements. How do we feel about our muscle tissue models? Thumbs up, thumbs down. What questions do we have? Okay. Got a couple of thumbs up. Gloria's gritting her teeth. Oh, nice. We got a vampire going on. I like it. Halloween's going to be here here before we know it, right? We get to start talking about bones too, so it's perfect. Right in time for Halloween. Okay, well, what I'm going to mention is I'm not going to take time to go through and help you answer all of the matching questions on page 2, because there's some great resources in the guided lesson to help you out with help matching those terms up. At the end of our time today, if we happen to have extra time, if there are particular ones you're interested in hearing about, let me know. Otherwise, I think there are a few others that's going to be more worth our time to talk about together. So don't forget to learn about those specific terms that we use for parts of a muscle cell. One of them that we already talked about is that Sarcoplasmic Reticulum that's storing and releasing calcium for us. So there's one of them that we talked about together. What I want to talk about with you is something in anatomy that we call the functional unit of contraction. So what we're going to talk about now is the sarcomere. And so the terminology of textbooks, I'll type it out here for you, functional unit of contraction. That's a big fancy anatomy word for saying when we talk about muscle contraction, here's where it actually happens. So when a muscle contracts, when it goes from being long to becoming short, this is what's actually changing size, this thing called the sarcomere. Now, if we were in lab, and I know we can all agree we're sad that we're not in lab, right? If we were in lab together, this is probably one of the coolest models that we have in lab because this model actually moves. So right now we're looking at a picture of the sarcomere when it's completely contracted, when it's squeezed together. The way that I know is see these little red lines on the outside here? These red lines are really close together to each other. This is a sarcomere that is contracted. So first, let me draw a bracket that you don't have. We'll add this little bracket just for ourselves. A sarcomere is this entire thing. So a sarcomere goes from one red line to the other red line. The name of these red lines matches their appearance. So these red lines make a zigzag pattern. They zigzag back and forth. These red lines are called Z-discs. Z-discs, because they zigzag back and forth. So from one Z-disc to the other Z-disc, I'll label the other side too, that's the borders of a sarcomere, from one zigzag to the other zigzag. When I'm doing muscle contraction, my zigzags get really close together. When I'm not doing muscle contraction, these zigzags spread really far apart. So in the process of muscle contraction, my two Z-discs get closer to one another. Specifically, they're getting closer and being pulled toward this blue thing that I see right here. This blue thing that I see right here is another group of proteins. It's proteins found in the middle of the sarcomere. The name of the proteins found in the middle of the sarcomere is called the M line. The M line in the middle of the sarcomere. So this line of proteins in the very middle is the M line. My zigzagging proteins on either side are called the Z-discs. Now, we're going to talk about in a moment when we look up close at this model, and you can kind of see it in our picture here. There are types of proteins that are found inside a sarcomere. We have these red ones that are called thin filaments because they're not very, very fat. And then we've got these blue ones here that are called the thick filaments. In the middle of my sarcomere, notice how there's a really small space right now. This small space in the middle represented with my bracket. This small space in the middle is where I only have my thick filaments. So the place in the sarcomere where there's only the thick filaments, that's called the H zone. The H zone. So I'll make a note for us. Only thick filaments present. Only thick filaments. So when I'm looking at this sarcomere, this part of a muscle cell that's squeezed down small because I'm contracting, the place where there's only thick filaments, that's called the H zone. When I relax my sarcomere, it'll be a lot easier to see the H zone. But just a heads up for us, this space here in the middle where there's only thick filaments, that's the H zone. In the very middle of the H zone is the M line, the midline of proteins right here. And then on either side, remember we've got those zigzagging Z discs on either side. Now imagine with me that we're going to zoom in just on this half of my sarcomere over here. So my next picture only shows me half of my sarcomere. Let's look at this picture. When I'm looking at my picture here, here is the M line, the midline of that sarcomere. Let me label it M line. It looked a little bit more blue on our last picture, but remember, this is the protein in the very middle of the sarcomere, the M line. I know you guys can help me out with this one in the chat. What was the name of this zigzag set of proteins that I find on the left side? What's the name of the zigzag? Yeah, the zigzags are the Z discs. I've got a Z disc over here that's zigzagging back and forth. So imagine, to help us get a frame of reference for what we're looking at here, imagine here's my M line, that I've also got some of those blue proteins over here, and I've got some of the red proteins over here, and there'd be another Z disc all the way over here. If you're trying to compare the two pictures to each other, this is just half of our last picture. We've got our Z disc, our zigzag on the edge. We've got our M line, those dark proteins in the middle. What was the name again of the place where I only have thick filaments? What did we call that place on the last one where there was only thick filaments? Yeah, that's called the H zone. The place in my sarcomere where there's only thick filaments. And notice this sarcomere is relaxed now because I've got a really big H zone. I've got a lot of space where there's only these thick filaments here that we see in blue. These thick filaments, by the way, their name is myosin. Myosin. So my protein, my blue protein that makes up these thick filaments is called myosin. The parts of the sarcomere where we only have myosin, only have the blue protein here, those are called the H zone. The parts of the sarcomere where I only have this red filament, the thin filament, these areas are called the I band. The I band. Now, let me help you out with something. When we're trying to remember thick filament versus thin filament, where are they found? The letter I is a really thin letter. The letter H is a really thick letter or really wide letter. So the H zone is where we have thick filaments with the thick letter H. The I band is where we have thin filaments with the thin letter I. The thin filament is a little bit more complicated than the thick filament is. The only kind of protein found in these blue guys here is myosin. When we're talking about the thin filament, we actually have 3 different proteins that are found inside of there. So the main protein that makes up the thin filament is the red protein. You see all these little red dots that are connected to each other. The name of the red dot protein is actin. So when you're thinking about the proteins that do muscle contraction, myosin and actin are the 2 proteins that actually do it. Myosin attaches to actin and pulls on it and slides it past each other. So myosin is the blue protein, the one in the thick filament. Actin is the red protein, the one that makes up most of the thin filament. Now, wrapping around actin is a yellow protein that kind of looks like a spaghetti noodle. See this little yellow line right here? So this yellow line, that's my spaghetti noodle protein that I see here. This yellow protein is called tropomyosin. Tropomyosin. Tropomyosin, my spaghetti noodle protein, its job is to cover the places where myosin would normally attach to actin. So tropomyosin covers, it's called the myosin binding sites. Its job is to make it so that myosin can't always attach to actin. The thing with tropomyosin, though, the reason I like to call it a wet spaghetti noodle is because wet spaghetti noodles don't stay in, they're really floppy. They move all over the place. To help keep this wet spaghetti noodle in the right place, we're going to use these little green pushpin proteins that I see on here. These little green pushpin proteins are a protein, I'm going to type it up high, called troponin. Troponin. Draw a line for us. Troponin is my green pushpin proteins. Their job is to hold tropomyosin in place. Tropomyosin blocks the places where myosin would normally attach to actin. Because if myosin attaches to actin, I can do muscle contraction. Okay, let's pause for a moment. Thin filament, seen here in red with yellow and green. Thick filament, seen here in blue. Remember, thick filament only has one protein. We only have to learn one name. Thin filament has 3 proteins, and each of those proteins do a slightly different job. How do we feel about our sarcomere model? The sarcomere model. I'm expecting, let's see if I can find it here. There we go. I'm expecting a little bit of this, some mind blownness going here. Question says, on the skeletal muscle model, I added the I band and the A band to the myofibrils. Yeah, so great question. I will answer that one after I answer Nicole's question really fast. Nicole asked if the job of tropomyosin was to hold actin in place. Not quite. Remember, tropomyosin blocks the myosin binding sites. So you can use that word in its name. Tropomyosin blocks the myosin binding sites so that myosin can't attach to actin. Actin is held in place just by the fact that it attaches to the Z-disc proteins. When we talk about the terminology of holding something in place, the one that really holds something in place is troponin, my pushpin that holds tropomyosin in place. So my pushpin protein, troponin, holding tropomyosin, my spaghetti noodle protein, in place. So Jacqueline mentioned our skeletal muscle model. And I'm actually going to bounce back to that one because that's a great point here. My skeletal muscle model right here. So we're back in our picture from page 2 here. My skeletal muscle model, you can actually see some of these things that we just talked about. So these places light, where I see these white spaces here, those are the places that we just called the I band. The I band. So the I band is the place where I only have the thin filament. When you look inside skeletal muscle tissue, those places look really light in comparison. These areas that look dark, that are next to it, are actually something we didn't make you label on the sarcomere, but they are important for us to know in our description. That's called the A band. A band, let's do a little word math here. The A band is made out of 2 parts. It's made out of a part called the H zone plus something called the zone of overlap. So this terminology A band, it's made out of the H zone that we already talked about and the zone of overlap. That's a new thing for us here. Who can remind me in the chat, what did I find in the H zone? What was in the H zone of a sarcomere? Yeah, the H zone is where I only had thick filaments. Only my thick filaments, so only myosin, absolutely. H zone only has myosin. Hey, not a trick question here. What do we think happens in the zone of overlap? Not a trick question, I promise. What do we think happens in the zone overlap? Okay, so contraction, we're on the right track there. Let's think even simpler than that. If contraction is going to happen, what do I need to have? Yeah, I need to have some overlap. I need to have myosin and actin proteins attached to each other. They need to be overlapping. So you can have things that are separate, right? But then you could overlap them with each other. So you take one piece of paper and put another on top of it. We'd say they're overlapping. In the zone of overlap, I have thick and thin filaments. I've got both of them, thick and thin filaments, a place where the two of them are together. So this dark spot that you see in my myofibril, and we see it here too, and we see it down here, the dark spots that we're seeing, the entire thing, we would call the A band. So it includes the H zone, which would be in the very middle. I guess that's a bad placement of my line here. Let's move my line so it's not quite there. The A band is all of the dark space that I see in here. And then we got the I band, the light space. All of the dark space, A band, then the light space, I band. H zone in the very middle, this darkness I see here. Then places where the thick and the thin filament overlap with each other. By the way, here's how I remember A band. We got the letter H, right? If I want to turn the letter H into the letter I, I'm going to need these two parts to kind of bend toward each other. So it makes, oops, get my pencil back here. We make the letter A by bending these parts of the letter H toward where the letter I is. So letter A band, that's where I have my overlap, where my thick filaments and my thin filaments overlap with each other to give me this A band. So back to the question that we mentioned before. You're absolutely right that these dark spots, A band, light spots, I band. Dark spots, A band, light spots, I band. I will not ask you that on a homework assignment or on the exam, but that's a great connection to make sure that we understand it. So awesome connection to pull together. Any last minute questions about muscle tissue? Because we're about to shift gears big time out of muscle tissue into big picture muscle. Are we tracking with me? How are we feeling? Come up with a fun question because I feel like I'm not hearing enough from you guys. Let's see. If you could have any food or drink right now, yeah, Gloria's cross-eyed. Any food or drink right now, no bars at all. What? No bars. Sorry, no holds. That's what I meant by the word bars. There's nothing's off limits. If you could have anything right now, what would it be to help you wake up? Karina's saying coffee. Yeah, and more coffee. Yeah, Starbucks coffee. My husband and I are currently brewing Starbucks coffee in our house. We've decided that with how crazy life is right now, like there are a few things that bring us joy in life because it's so crazy. So we decided that we're going to spend a little extra money to brew Starbucks coffee at home and not just, we did a lot of Folgers for a while. Or I'm a big fan of Aldi. I don't know if there's any other Aldi shoppers out there. We get a lot of coffee at Aldi too. But we were like, you know what? We are stuck at home like indefinitely. We're going to brew Starbucks coffee. So yeah, it does smell really nice when we brew it. And it tastes really nice too. So we're drinking the Starbucks coffee over here. Let's be real. I like the idea of cake though, Nicole. That cake looks pretty good too. Sitting on my desk right now is a package of Oreos, because last night when I was up late working, that was my snack of choice. Just being real, I do like some Oreos. So, okay. Well, let's switch gears then. We're going to talk about naming skeletal muscles. What I'm going to say is I'm not going to go through this exactly the way that it is in the lab packet, because you've got the guided lesson that goes through it bit by bit, the way that it does in the lab packet. I'm going to teach it to you in maybe a slightly different way, using the same examples from the lab packet, just kind of in a different order. So now might be a good time to grab like a random piece of paper or something else to take notes on, because I'm not going to track exactly with that lab packet for you. In the body, we have over 600 muscles that have names. If we were in class together, I would tell you guys, and we will learn all of them. And you would freak out for a moment, and then you'd realize that I was telling a joke. Let's be real though, when we're in this environment, I'm not even going to crack a joke like that. We're definitely not going to learn 600 muscle names. But if we have over 600 muscle names, there's got to be some kind of pattern to coming up with all of those names. So we have kind of 7 different rules, or maybe you could think about it as 7 different kinds of information that you can get about a muscle based on its name. So we're going to work through some examples of muscles to get an idea of what kind of trigger words you're looking for in their names to help you get information from them. You will notice, by the way, that each week going forward in our lab packets, when you're doing the homework, there's always going to be some questions that ask you about the kind of information that we can get from the name of a muscle. So these rules are not something that we're just learning one week and giving up on. It's things that we're going to remind ourselves week by week of how we're seeing them come up again. One of the ways that we see muscles named is based on their general location in the body. So I'm going to put a note here under this word gluteus. It helps me know the location in the body. This word gluteus sounds really close to something else we've talked about in our class before. Can you help me out in the chat? What does gluteus sound like? What does the word gluteus sound like? Any ideas? Yeah, the gluteal region. Gluteus is referring to gluteal region, or maybe more accurately, the gluteal region gets its name from this muscle, gluteus muscle. Here's what I'll say about these muscles we see here. We've got gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, gluteus minimus. This gluteus word in their name sounds like the gluteal region. If you see a muscle name that sounds like a regional term that you learned way back in week 2, if we see something that matches up, I would say you are 99% likely to find that muscle in that region of the body. So when I look at a muscle name and I see this word gluteus, that should tip off in my mind, oh, this is in the gluteal region of the body, which is kind of in the rump region. There we go. Let's put it in politically correct terms, right? So the rump region is the gluteal region there. The first part of this muscle name tells me that's where I'm found. So one kind of information you find in the name of muscles is where they're found. It might pair up with a regional term, in this case, the gluteal region. Another kind of information that I can find from the name of a muscle is things about its general size. So general size. Things like the word maximus, things like the word minimus. You can also see in my picture here, we also have a gluteus medius. These words come together in groups, meaning all of these muscles have the same first name, gluteus, but they have different last names, maximus, minimus, medius. The way they get that different last name is because they all have different sizes. So my maximus muscle, if you ever see that word maximus, that means the biggest. When I see the word minimus, that's going to mean the smallest. Other words that are going to refer to the size of a muscle, you're going to see things like major versus minor. So an example of this would be a muscle called Pectoralis Major. A Pectoralis Major is a lot like Gluteus Maximus. I've got information about its location here in its name. Where was the pectoral region? Did we learn that one? Maybe we didn't learn that one. Now I'm questioning. Did we learn the pectoral region? Okay, we did. Okay. The pectoral region is the chest region. Pectoralis major is the big muscle, major means big, found in the chest. Pectoral means chest. Pectoralis minor is the small one that's still found in the chest. So first idea when you're looking at names of muscles, if I see something that looks like a regional term, that's going to be its location in the body. If I see a size word, so maximus versus minimus, major versus minor, another one that you'll see in a guided lesson, longus versus brevis. That means that something's really long compared to something that is shorter. Anytime you see these kinds of words, these words tell me the size of a muscle. Anytime we see a location word, that's going to tell me where in the body it might be. So two kinds of information in the names of muscles we've talked about so far, their location and their size. There's two kinds of information. Let's look at some examples of muscles from the abdominal part of the body. We're actually learning the abdominal muscles this week. So when we talk about the abdominal muscles, notice that multiple of them have this word abdominis in their name. Again, when I use this word abdominis, I'm referring to the location in the body. We're in the abdominal region. So these muscles are found in the abdomen. Now these parts of their name, so we have rectus abdominis, we have transversus abdominis, and while we're at it, we do also have oblique muscles. All three of these words in the names of our abdominal muscles here, all of these refer to the direction of the muscle, or the direction of the muscle fibers, as it's sometimes described, the cells that are inside of it. This word rectus means parallel. So notice with rectus abdominis that we're going straight up and down. We're parallel to your spine, for example. We could say it's parallel to the spine. So this muscle goes the same direction. It's parallel to the spine. That's why I call it the rectus muscle. And I call it rectus abdominis because it's in the abdominal region. Let me plug in my computer here. I just realized it's about to die. There we go. Okay, rectus abdominis. That's a word that means parallel. Oops, parallel. Okay. Next word is transversus. Transversus is what we see in the deepest layer of the abdomen. Transversus abdominis means that we're perpendicular. Perpendicular, if you remember way back from geometry, if you ever took geometry, perpendicular lines look like this. So we've got one line that's going left and right, one line that's going up and down. These things are perpendicular to each other. They're opposites, basically. Transversus abdominis is my layer of muscle fibers that are perpendicular or opposite to the vertebral column in the back. Transversus abdominis. So transversus meaning perpendicular, opposite of the the spine, for example. My last word in the name is oblique. Oblique just means that we're at an angle. So at an angle. We actually have two different sets of angles that fibers go when we're talking about the abs. Some of my fibers go up and down, or go at this angle, like we see with the external obliques. The internal obliques actually go the opposite direction. So both of them are going at an angle. They're not going straight up and down. They're not going perpendicular. They're going at this angle. That's what makes them an oblique. And again, in the abdominal region, we've got two layers of obliques. The external one on the very outside, the internal one right underneath it. So the question in the chat is a good question. Yeah. So on the homework assignment, when we ask you about how these muscles are named, you need to pay attention to which word we're asking you about. So there are two questions I could ask you about this muscle right here. I could ask you about what this word transversus in its name means and what this word abdominis in its name means. So if the question on the assignment asks you, for this muscle transversus abdominis, what information does this word transversus tell me? You would tell me that it's the direction of the muscle fibers when we're talking about transversus. If I ask you what this word abdominis in its name means, abdominis doesn't tell me about the direction of the fibers. Abdominis tells me about the location of the muscle. So please pay close attention when you're working on the homework assignment. Which of these words in its name am I asking you about? Because it makes a difference, right? I would answer them differently because transversus tells me one thing, abdominis tells me the other. So great question. Pay attention to what we're asking for, because you'd either tell me that it's about the fibers or it's about the location. Good question. If I ask you about both of the ways it's named, you would tell me both of those things. Okay, so we've said we can name things based on their location. We've said that we can name them based on their size. We've said we can name them based on the direction that they're traveling. Let's talk about another way that we can name them. And that way that we can name them is based on their shape. Based on their shape. So we have some muscles in the face called the Orbicularis Oculi and the Orbicularis oris muscle. The Orbicularis oris, that's what we see right here. The Orbicularis oculi is what we see right here. This word orbicularis means that it's a circle, or it's encircling, if you will. Anytime I see the word orbicularis, I'm thinking of a circle. Oh, I like that, Tierney. Yeah, it orbits around it, going around in a circle. Perfect. The only difference between Orbicularis oculi and Orbicularis oris are these words that I see, the second set of words. What do these words tell me in general about these muscles? What do these words mean? Oculi or oris? Any guesses? Yeah, Gloria's right. She's nervous, but she's right. These are location words. Location words. Yeah, so Nicole's 100% correct. She says oculi sounds like the ocular region. That's correct. Oculi, we can make that connection to ocular region. So, yeah, so then we're going to do the same thing here with oris. It sounds like the oral region. 100%. We learned the oral region. We learned the ocular region, or the oculars, I guess we talked about on the microscope. I think did we call it the ocular region, or did we call it something else? There's a couple of different names. Optic, did we call it optic or ocular? Okay, yeah, I mean, think of the ocular lens. That'll help you figure it out too. So, ocular region is the name of the region around the eyes. Orbicularis Oculi, we're found by the eyes and we're a circle. Orbicularis, we're a circle. Orbicularis oris, we're a circle and we're found around the mouth. So again, we got to look at those questions on the homework. Am I asking you about orbicularis, or am I asking you about oculi, or am I asking you about oris? Pay particular attention to which of the words in its name that we're asking about, because it can be location, it can be shape, it can be size, it can be different things. Let's do another one here. We have in the forearm, so now we're down in the forearm region for you here. We have a couple of muscles that are called flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris. Now we've added in a new way of naming muscles, and that way comes from this word flexor that we see here. When we talk about a flexor muscle, we are now describing the action of the muscle. So we're going to talk briefly about muscle actions here in a moment, but this word flexor looks a lot like the action word called flexion. You will see some muscles that are called extensors. That looks a whole lot like the word extension. Or we're going to see what are called the adductors. That looks like a word called adduction. So anytime you see a muscle name that looks like an action word that you know, that tells you what that muscle is going to do. It's going to do flexion, it's going to do extension, it's going to do adduction. That's what these muscles are going to do. That's what their action is. We've got another regional term, right? Carpi, that's referring to the carpal region, the wrist region. Check out these right here, though. What do these look like? Radialis and ulnaris. What do those look like? Yeah, those look like the bone names, right? Bone names, which are also regional terms, right? So they're when I look at these names, the reason, way back in week 1, that we made you memorize the names of the bones, first reason was to help you out with learning the regional terms, the radial region, the ulnar region. The second reason was to help you with identifying what bones these muscles are by. So we're listing names of bones here. These are regions or places where we can do attachment sites. That's another example of the kind of information that a muscle name has. So we're attaching in the carpal region. We are found by the radius and the ulna. We're doing the process of flexion. See how this big long name, which makes it look and sound scary, it actually just tells me a whole lot about it. It tells me what it does, what it attaches to, where it's found, all of that kind of information inside the name of this muscle here. So flexors, extensors, adductors, all of that stuff tells you what these muscles do. Let's go to the thigh. The thigh has a group of muscles together that are called quadriceps. The quadriceps muscle is a new kind of information for us. So the quadriceps muscle tells us the number of origins. Number of origins. Quadriceps means I've got 4 origins, 4 places where my muscles attach. We also have something called the biceps. Can we take a guess in the chat? How many attachment sites would biceps have? Yeah, biceps is going to have 2. We've got the triceps. Triceps is going to have, 3, just like a tricycle, right? So quadriceps means that I have 4 attachment sites. Now, quadriceps is technically a muscle group. It's made out of 4 different named muscles. So quadriceps tells me there's 4 attachment sites. And as it so happens, there's 4 different muscles that are here. So let's look at our first muscle right here. This muscle right here is called Rectus Femoris. Does anyone happen to remember what that rectus word meant? Rectus? Yeah, the word rectus on a muscle meant that it was parallel. Parallel. The rectus muscle is the one that goes parallel, it goes up and down parallel to which bone? What does its name tell us? The bone that it's by. It's by the femur. Yep. Rectus femoris is the bone or the muscle in the middle of your thigh that goes parallel to the femur. That's what rectus means, parallel. Parallel to the femur, rectus femoris. That's one of my muscles in the quadriceps. Other muscles in the quadriceps are called vastus muscles. This word vastus means vast, or in other words, it means really big, really big. I have 3 really big thigh muscles. Notice that those really big thigh muscles are called medialis, lateralis, and intermedius. Hey, this sounds like directional terms. Vastus medialis. That's going to mean it's medial. What does medial mean? What does that directional term medial mean? Yeah, medial means closer to the midline. Closer to the midline. Absolutely. So lateral is going to mean farther from the midline. Farther from the midline. Vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, the big muscles that are toward the middle or toward the outside of the leg. So again, look for those directional terms, look for those regional terms, look for those size terms. Vastus, major, minor, all of those things tell me what size these muscles are. Let me check. Okay, that is the extent of the muscle naming that I'm going to cover with you guys. I know we're processing it. It was a lot of information for me to throw at you at once. What questions do we have? I do see the question in the chat. This word intermedius. Intermedius means intermediate. We didn't talk a lot about that one, but it basically just means in between. Yeah, Tyranny is completely right. So we've got medial, intermediate, which is wedged in the middle, and lateral on the outside. So our direction, we would go medial to intermediate to lateral, which actually this progression is something you're going to want to learn when it comes time for us to learn the tarsal bones. Put that question out for you. Where are the tarsal bones found? Tarsals. Yeah, in the ankle. We have 3 ankle bones that are all called, they all have the same last name, called cuneiform bones. We have a medial cuneiform, an intermediate cuneiform, and a lateral cuneiform. So as long as we know this progression from middle to outside, that's going to help us to know where they are. Yeah, did he break one of those bones? My husband had told me this morning that he broke his ankle. I don't know which particular bones it was that Dak Prescott, Cowboys quarterback, right? I'm so bad at sports right now. We're really just not watching. Yeah, so he broke some tarsal bones. Maybe we can do some digging and see if we can figure it out. Back in the day, I followed the Oklahoma City Thunder quite extensively when I was up in Tulsa, and it was really funny because, well, it wasn't funny, but it was really great because I knew my anatomy. And when Kevin Durant, when he used to be with the Thunder, when he broke particular bones in his foot, I was like, I know exactly which one that is. And like they were talking about him having inflammation of the pollicis muscle. That's one of them that attaches down to the toe. So I was like, anatomy in real life. Look at that. Any other questions? So rectus is direction and vastus is size. Vastus would tell me it's size. It's a really big one. Yeah, I'm not sure if you're referring to Dak or to Kevin Durant, but either of them, yes. Breaking bones is a good excuse for Dak. Okay, yep, yeah, a good excuse for losing all the games. Yeah, it's been a little rough, hasn't it? Okay, trying to think. I'm gonna peek at the worksheet here. Some of so that's what I was gonna ask. How many of you guys are free to come tonight at 5? Most of us. Okay. So here's what I'm going to plan to do then. Let's, what I'm going to spend the rest of our time this morning doing is I want to teach you guys what the movement words mean, and talk maybe briefly about bone markings, maybe. We may not have time for that. But tonight, what I'll plan to do today at 5, I will plan for us to go through, we're going to use visible body to help us with identifying particular muscles, for helping us to look at those muscle actions and to look at some of those bone markings as well. So anything that we don't get to during our time now, we will talk about tonight at 5. If you have time between now and 5 o'clock, go into visible body for this week, because there's some really awesome resources related to the movements. So we'll pull those up in class together tonight at 5, but try to take a peek at it just to see. Honestly, the thing I think that is best about visible body, the reason I was most sold on us starting to try to use it, is because of muscle actions and because of identifying muscles. I think it's going to be really helpful for those things. So try to play around with it a little bit, and we'll do it more tonight at 5 o'clock. Oh, perfect. Yeah, and Tierney said Elise has a session today at noon as well. So plan to pop into that too, especially since we're coming up on a test, right? So starts to be great to have as much review as possible. Okay, here's probably what we will end with today. Is we're going to end with talking about our muscle movement words. So when we talk about how some of the muscles in the body are named based on the movements that they do, it would be really helpful for us to start to know what those movements look like, or how those movements work. So when we talk about learning movement words, you've got the big matching on page 6. I'm going to try to describe what these words mean. It may not match word for word the way they're described on page 6, but the big deal with movement words is we want to learn them in pairs. Almost all of the movement words that you're learning are opposites of each other. So the more we can learn them in pairs, kind of like we did with some of our other ideas this semester, opposites, the more we can learn that, like with the directional terms, the better off we are. So our first pair of words that are opposites of each other are flexion and extension. Flexion and extension have to do with the angle that we form at a joint, or basically the distance between two bones. When I do flexion, let's do a little drawing here. Imagine that this is my elbow joint right here. So here we're going to really test our knowledge of bones right here. If this is my elbow, what bone is this one right here? My stick right here would represent what bone? If this is my elbow. Yeah, this would be my humerus. Look at this. If you guys can identify this as the humerus on my little sketch, you are like so set, right? Okay, so here's my humerus. And the bones that are down here, what would these guys be? If that's the elbow, these would be the radius and the ulna. Perfect. Okay, so let's pretend, and you can do this with yourself too, so you can put your arm out. Here's your humerus, here's your radius and the ulna. When I do the process of flexion, I am going to do this. So let me draw. We're going to do all kinds of colors now. The process of flexion is when you take your humerus and your radius and your ulna and you bring them closer together. Exactly. Yeah, Jacqueline mentioned we're doing a bicep curl. So, oh, here, I'll make this fun here. We'll add little fingers, right? Totally not anatomically correct, but awesome. Okay. When I take my forearm and I bring it closer to my arm, when I take my radius and the ulna and I bring them closer to the humerus, the amount of space, my angle in between them got smaller. That's what flexion is. When my angle gets smaller, that's the easy description of it. When I'm doing the process of extension, I'm going to start with my arm up and I'm going to end with my arm back down. So increasing the distance between two bones, making it a bigger angle that I see here, that's the process of extension. Yeah, so that the exercise at the gym is the tricep extension, absolutely. So flexing the biceps and then technically flexing the triceps or extending the arm using the triceps, that they're opposites of each other. If we were in class together, I would make you act these things out. The good news is nobody can see you. So as you're sitting at your desk, on your bed, wherever you are, practice flexing your forearm, bringing it up closer to your chest, and then extending it back down. Flexion and extension. Hey, let me switch things up on us here. When we talk about, let me draw a new picture for us here. Okay, I'm now looking at, look at my lovely little joints here. This is my knee. There's my knee joint. That means that this is what bone? This is my knee joint. Yep, here's that femur. And so down here we've got the tibia and the fibula, right? Hey, so check this out. When I did flexion, what happened to the distance between my bones? When I do flexion, yeah, the angle got smaller, the distance between them got smaller. When you flex your knee joint, we actually bring your leg back. So there's those little toes. We go from having a big angle to a small angle. Flexion of your knee joint actually pulls your leg backwards. Flexion of your elbow joint pulls your forearm forward. So flexion just always means we make the angle smaller, whether it's, and again, I would encourage you, act this out yourself, whether you're pulling your tibia and your fibula close to your femur toward the back of your body, whether you're pulling your radius and your ulna close to the humerus on the front side of your body, that's flexion. Extension then is going to be when we bring it back, oops, get my pencil back, when we bring it back down, right? So we start bent and then we bring it back to a wider angle. That's the process of extension. So if the angle gets smaller, that's flexion. If the angle gets bigger, that's extension. It's really easy to do this with your elbow, really easy to do this with your legs as well. Hey, the other thing that you can do, I'm going to turn on my camera briefly so we can do this together. The other flexion, ooh, okay, we got to change my settings. The other flexion that we okay, we can also do this with our wrist joint. So if you take your wrist joint, I'm going to try to do this with the camera, kind of weird, okay? See, I got my wrist joint here. I can bend it up, flexion of the wrist, and I can bend it back down, extension of the wrist. So flexion and extension, it's all about just bringing things together. It's the same thing we were talking about the bicep curl, right? So stand up for you, flexion and extension, flexion and extension. So it's always just all about bringing things closer together or farther apart, flexion and extension. Yeah, so Nicole asks us the same thing when we bow. Yeah, we would call that forward flexion of the vertebral column. So forward flexion, going forward, and then we can do extension backwards. The other thing we can do with the back, or we can also do this with the wrist joint. So here, I'm going to hold my wrist joint up. Here, help me out in the chat with words here. When I do this movement, my angle got smaller. What's the word for what I just did here? My angle got smaller. Okay, I did flexion. Perfect. Okay, now watch. My angle gets bigger. What did I just do here? What's the name of that? That's extension. Yep. Hey, with the wrist joint, I can do this. I went back farther than anatomical position. When you go farther than anatomical position, yeah, it's called hyperextension. So if we go back even farther from where you normally are, when you look at your body in that awkward anatomical position, that's called hyperextension. So we can do hyperextension with your head, right? You can flex it forward, extend it back up, hyperextend it back. So hyperextension is when I go even farther back from normal. We cannot do hyperextension with our knees. We cannot do it with our elbows without breaking some bones or tearing some ligaments. So flexion and extension, opposites of each other. Yeah, ouch is right. Especially if we were to hyperextend our elbow, literally we would have to break parts of our bones, because we're going to learn in a couple of weeks the name of the bone part that sticks up. Your joint actually has something in the back that blocks it from the bone from going back farther. Unless I break this off, not going to happen. Yeah, so Tyranny asked about double jointed. If you're double jointed, that typically means that your ligaments are loose. So the way that the bones come together is a little bit looser than it is in most people. That's what double jointed usually means. Yeah. Okay, gonna turn off, well, I'll leave my camera on because we'll do flexion and extension together too. Okay, flexion and extension, angle gets bigger and gets smaller. Next thing I can do is abduction versus adduction. The way I like to remember abduction is what it would look like if the aliens abducted me. So here's Dr. Ollis. Gonna draw Dr. Ollis really fast here. I'm just chilling out, doing my normal thing. Aliens come. Got a sweet little UFO going on over here. Some aliens come, they want to abduct me. And what's gonna happen is my arms are gonna get pulled up. My legs are gonna get pulled up. I'm being abducted. Now, technically here, we gotta have a little alien, right? I draw penguins for you guys all the time. When I was in elementary school though, aliens were my jam. So I'm really good at drawing aliens, just not small. Okay, there's my little alien abducting me. Abduction technically just means that we're moving something away from the midline of the body. The way I like to remember that with alien abduction though, is if they start to abduct your arms and they pull your arms up, that's abduction. So when your arms are normal and you get abducted by an alien, we're getting pulled up, that's abduction. Adduction is just the opposite. So if the aliens let me come back and I go from having my arms and legs being pulled up to back down to normal, that is adduction. Technically speaking though, here, let's get the technical definition. Abduction, away from the midline of the body, that's abduction. Adduction, toward the midline of the body. What I want you all to do, and no one can see you, so it's totally fine. If you put up your hand, I want you to start with your hand like this, with all your fingers together. When we spread our fingers out, we've moved them away from the midline. that is abduction. When I squeeze them back together, that is adduction. So abduction away from the midline, adduction back together. We added them together. We can do this with arms, we can do this with legs, we can do this with fingers and toes. So abduction and adduction, another movement set of pairs that we can do there. Next things we can do are rotation. All I'll mention here with rotation is we need to know the difference between medial and lateral. If I do medial rotation, which way am I rotating things? What does medial mean again? What's medial rotation? Exactly, toward the midline. So best places for these rotation words, shoulders and hips. Medial rotation is when you rotate your entire shoulder medially toward the midline. Lateral rotation, we rotate it back away from the midline. We can do this with the hip joint. Again, no one can see you. So when you rotate your entire leg toward the middle, rotate your entire leg toward the outside, that's medial versus lateral rotation. Those are the big joints we're going to learn it at. So shoulder joint, medial rotation in, lateral rotation out, same thing with those hips. When we do some movements with the ankle, we have a couple of special names for what we do with the ankle. So let's talk first. The way I like to remember these two guys are the two ways you can roll your ankle to get a sprain. Inversion versus eversion. So inversion is when you take your ankle, so we'll pretend this is my ankle joint here. Inversion is when it rolls in. When my ankle rolls toward the inside, that's inversion. When my ankle rolls toward the outside, that's eversion. Again, the two ways you can roll your ankle. So wherever you're sitting, when you pull your ankle, the sole of your foot comes up toward the middle, that's called inversion. When the sole of your foot goes out toward the outside, that's called eversion. Inversion and eversion. Both of those, we only do that with the ankle joint. The other movement that we only do with the ankle joint is dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. And these have regional terms in their name. Let's start with plantar flexion. Where's the plantar region of the foot? The plantar region? I totally like half gave it away. You guys got the bottom of the foot. Yep, so it's on the foot, the plantar region, in case we didn't remember that. So plantar flexion, the plantar surface of your body is the sole of your foot. Plantar flexion is when you take your toes and you push them toward the ground. Plantar flexion is what you do to go into being on your tiptoes. So plantar flexion, when at my ankle joint, I push all the bones down into the ground toward the plantar region, which is the bottom of the foot. Dorsiflexion is like the dorsal region of the body. Where's the dorsal region of the body? Do you remember the dorsal region? Yeah, so the dorsal region is the entire backside of the body. When I do dorsiflexion, this is when you take your foot and you bend it toward the back of the body at the ankle joint. So this is when like you're rocking on the balls of your feet or on your heels. Dorsiflexion, when we rock back onto our heels, that's dorsiflexion. When we stand on our tiptoes, that's plantar flexion, when we push those toes toward the plantar surface. So inversion and eversion, when we go in or when we go out. Then if we're thinking about our foot, when we do plantar flexion, we plant down. When we do dorsiflexion, we rock back. We pull up our toes. Yeah, so Nicole is absolutely right. The toes go up when you do dorsiflexion because you're rocking back onto your heels. Absolutely. Two more things that I'll mention. These ones are not pairs. Everything else we've talked about are pairs. Retraction and elevation are not pairs, just as a heads up. This word retraction, we're only ever going to see it used when we're talking about moving the mandible. Where in the body is the mandible? Where's the mandible in the body? Do you remember? Yeah, that's the name of the jawbone, right? The mandible. So when we talk about retraction of the mandible, this is when you pull your jaw backwards. So it ends up kind of looking like you have an overbite if your jaw is constantly retracted. So probably you're not going to be able to see because my camera is small. But retraction is when I do this. So when you pull that jaw backwards, retraction. I'll mention, you don't have to know this word, but the opposite of retraction is protraction. Protraction is when you stick your jaw out. So I always like to tell the story that I am the oldest of 4 kids. The 3 younger are all boys. And they went through this phase where for every single family picture, they all protracted their jaws. So we have a ton of family pictures where all my brothers are going like this, sticking out that jaw. So protraction, you technically don't have to know it, but if you want to know the opposite for retraction, that's what it is. So sticking out the jaw versus pulling that jaw back in, retraction. Last word to mention is elevation. We are learning elevation in the context of the mandible, but we can do it with other bones in the body too. Elevation is part of what you do when you're chewing, when you pull the jaw up. For your reference, in case you want to know the opposite of elevation, the opposite of elevation is depression. And I like to crack the joke that this is what we experienced when we saw our scores on the lab midterm exam, right? Depression, where we dropped the jaw. So depression, jaw goes down. Elevation, jaw goes up. We also use this word elevation with the scapula. Does anyone remember where the scapula is found in the body? Where's the scapula? Yeah, so the scapula is in your back. The scapula is the bone that makes up the shoulder blade. That's what you feel when you touch your shoulder blade in the back. So the fact that, and now I'm like feeling like I need to do it right, how you can move your shoulders up and down, that's elevation and depression of the scapula. That's what's actually moving. With each of these movements, I'll mention here, we learned them in pairs. The reason that we learn them in pairs is because it relates to the types of muscles in the body. So as we're going through and learning muscle actions this semester, we are learning the muscles that are the prime mover of an action. That is the muscle that primarily does this action for us. Most actions in your body don't just take a prime mover, one muscle working by itself. Most muscles in the body also need helpers. So you'll see types of muscles called synergists that help to make things happen. So when you are picking up a cup, when I'm picking up my coffee mug here, right? Picking up something requires you not only to use your biceps in your forearm, or in your arm, excuse me, but also a muscle down here called brachioradialis that's in your forearm that's going to help to stabilize your elbow joint as you're picking things up. So a prime mover is the big one. If this doesn't work, this action is definitely not happening. A synergist helps that action to happen. If the synergist isn't working, it might still happen, just maybe not quite as well. But just like in physics, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, the physicists like to say. For every prime mover, we were just talking about the biceps as the prime mover of picking something up, we always have to have an antagonist. So antagonist is a muscle that does the opposite of what the prime mover does. So in this case, we've got the biceps that helps you to do the process of flexion, bringing something forward, bringing it closer together. The triceps do the opposite of flexion. The triceps do the process of extension, bringing your arms straight back. So we would say that these muscles are antagonists to each other. They do the opposite functions. Biceps, prime mover of the process of flexion. Triceps are the antagonist, for the process of flexion. Notice how these are found on the opposite side of the arms. That's going to be the same thing, muscles on the opposite sides of the leg, or even muscles found on the opposite sides of the body. So the front side versus the back side. Prime movers and antagonists are typically on the opposite side of the thing that they're working on. Because when we pull it one way, it does one action. When we pull the other way, it does the other action. So prime movers versus antagonists. That is where I'm gonna call it a day, since we're butting up against the end of our time today. We will pick up tonight in visible body, looking at bone markings, looking at muscle movements, and we will definitely make sure to work on that last activity together with the origins and the insertions of muscles. We'll definitely make sure we do that tonight together as well. So tonight at 5 o'clock, we will plan to work on that aspect of this lab. Yeah, you're welcome. Happy to be able to help us out that way. Before we call it a day now, any last minute questions that we have about this stuff that we've covered? Yeah, you're welcome, Christina and Jacqueline. And if you can't make it today at 5, I will definitely record that as well. So that'll post for you. You're welcome, Tierney. If we have no more last minute questions, I'll stop the recording and stick around for a little bit longer. And otherwise, I'll plan to see you guys at 5. So I'm going to stop that recording and I'll be here for a bit.